Hello, subscribers. I don't know why I bother saying things like, I'm gonna do things this way from now on, when I'm just constantly changing things. I think it's a combination of indecisiveness and impatience. I am using a new voice again, and this one actually matches my avatar, and hopefully will be more expressive. This is great because Subaru Natsuki is basically my spirit animal.
After taking a good look around, I found there was no one left but me. It was right then and there when I finally realized, despite all my efforts to be the center of attention, there was nothing special about me at all.
Anyway, about this video. Some time ago, Redeemed Zoomer made a video that triggered all the atheists and got a bunch of responses. And I'm here to respond to several of those responses at once. Specifically 4. Mindshift, Professor Plink, Skeptic, and XJW Panda Tower. The Prophet of Zod, peace be upon him, also made a response, but he didn't post it until after I had already made my selection, so unfortunately, it will not be covered. But I don't think he would have added anything special.
So let's answer them. Religion causes wars. Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion, and if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%.
For starters, this isn't an atheistic argument. This is not a reason to not believe in God. This is an anti-religion argument.
And who exactly do you think are making anti-religion arguments? Do you think Muslims are making them? How about Mormons? No, anti-religion argument or atheist arguments, which is what the video was titled, All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Not all atheistic arguments or arguments for atheism, but all arguments specifically done by atheists. This is a big sticking point with Plink, and Skeptic seems distracted by it as well. But Zoomer never claimed to only be going after arguments against God, but the arguments made by the people who are against God.
And you didn't even address the central premise of it. It wasn't that religion causes all wars, it was that religion causes wars. Period. Full stop. Which you yourself admitted to. Yeah, sure, it's true. The majority of wars are fought over things like government disputes, land disputes, one nation versus another, one ethnic group versus another, i.e. racism. But that doesn't mean that no wars are fought over religion. Also, not all wars are equal in their scope and devastation. I mean, you can't compare something like the Crusades, which killed an estimated 2 to 6 million people in Western Europe alone, at a time when the population of the area was only about 60 million, so potentially killing up to 10% of the population, and then compare that with something like, say, the British Zanzibar War of 1896, which lasted a whole 38 minutes and killed less than 500 people. But on a statistical breakdown of all the wars and their causes, both have the same power. They both count as one. So what if wars would still be fought without religion? There would certainly still be less wars. Also, why are you then removing the Muslim wars from the equation? Those don't count as religious wars all of a sudden? Again, atheists don't just have it out for Christianity specifically. We don't believe in any gods or religious practices. That includes Islam.
All good points. However, I want to point something out that may or may not come up later that we need to keep in mind to keep things in perspective. Zoomer is just answering all atheist arguments. He isn't claiming to debunk them, so this answer isn't meant to completely eradicate the argument, but only to weaken it or put it in perspective. Religion causes so few wars that using that as an argument is a bit ridiculous.
A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists. This doesn't mean religion is true, it just means you can't use that as an argument against it.
We don't. If it is ever used at all, it's used as an argument against organized religion, not as an argument against the existence of God.
Which is what this argument was about. Plink is so oblivious to the fact that atheists make arguments against religion that he missed how this argument was never presented as an argument against God. It was only presented as an argument against religion.
Also, Hitler was not an atheist. He had, on multiple occasions, declared himself as a Christian. See, I can quote mine Wikipedia as well. In reality, the truth of Hitler's personal religious ideology has long been a subject of dispute. He criticized the Catholic Church and Christianity as a whole, sure. He also openly criticized atheism, too. His book, Mein Kampf, contained multiple references to God or a creator.
Ooh, references! Because atheists never mention God, right?
But what is undeniable is that the wider Nazi regime and Nazi Germany as a whole was insanely Christian-dominated. 54% were Protestant, 40% Catholic, 3.5% neo-pagan, and a whole 1.5% of the population were non-believers.
Okay, but that isn't really relevant though, is it? Hitler was still in charge, so the actions taken by the Nazis, as a whole not individuals, was not Christian.
The claim I was only following orders has been used to justify too many tragedies in our history.
But before I move on, it may have been a mistake on Zoomer's part to use Hitler as the example. Not because it's a bad example, but because Hitler is like a religious hot potato. Christians pass him to atheists. Atheists pass him to Christians. And Muslims are on the sideline thinking, don't mention Muhammad. Don't mention Muhammad. Stalin would have been a better, more non-controversial example to use.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
Non sequitur. Not only is this not an atheistic argument, this isn't even an anti-religion argument, it's specifically an anti-Christian argument.
Which is made by atheists. This might be my favorite answer Zoomer gave, because as we are about to see, he got half the atheists to answer it themselves, and Plink falls for it the worst.
But also, you don't even attempt to dispute it. Seems that you agree with it. You admitted that you're only Christian because of where you were born. Your only attempted rebuttal is false, however, because I am specifically not an atheist because of where I was born. By way of where I was born and what belief system I was born into, I was and should still be a Christian. I am an atheist because I rejected the hegemonic religion of my upbringing.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
So then, if you use faith to reach conclusions, you'd have to accept every single position, because faith can't be right in one instance and wrong in all the others. Because how could you tell the right ones from the wrong ones? And faith isn't needed to be atheist. Being atheist is a lack of belief. No faith needed to not accept a claim.
So, skeptic's answer is not good, to put it politely. And this is a recurring theme with his answers. His answers are so bad that I only ended up using him 4 times. The answer by Zoomer does not imply that you use faith to figure out which worldview is true, but whichever one you think is true, you do have faith in. Skeptic is another atheist who got distracted by his own assumption that atheist arguments meant only arguments against God. The other atheists answered this much better. I think all of them pointed out that Zoomer didn't really answer the question, but I noticed a similarity between Zoomer's answer to this question and a later answer. Mindshift gave to a different argument.
A Christian says X, and it is an unfair claim, an assertion of something that is just ridiculous. The atheist says, well, what about this, to show that that is wrong? And then the Christian says, oh, you're trying to disprove God with this, and that's so weak. No, we're just talking about your earlier point that was unfair.
This argument seems to pair up with the whole 4,000 gods to 39.99 gods argument that gets answered later. So the atheist asks, how do you know which religion is true? Then Zoomer asks, how do you know which worldview is true? They are the same question. He is pointing out that atheists don't have an answer to the very question they are posing. And to this, atheists bring up the one God less argument, which I will talk more about when we get to it.
There's no scientific proof that God exists. Well, by definition, science can only prove things inside the natural world, and by definition, God is something outside the natural world. So science can neither prove nor disprove God.
You just attempted to define God into existence.
No, that is how God has always been defined, and I mean capital G God. The creator of everything, not some lesser Zeus or Odin who are a part of the creation, but the God who created literally everything outside of himself. He cannot be part of the natural world because he created it. This is logic 101.
You just defined God as existing outside the natural world. Well, now you have to establish that there is such a thing as outside the natural world to even exist in. Because I don't accept that it does.
That thinking is backwards. It is not that God exists in something, it's that everything exists in God.
This is the divine hiddenness argument. And what you don't seem to understand is that simply stating it does not prove it. By definition, God can't be proven by science, so haha, take that all of science. Take all of science off the board. No science for you. We win. No, that's not how it works. Especially when we're talking about a supposed God that does interact with the natural world in supposedly countless ways. A burning bush that doesn't get consumed by the fire? That's within the natural world.
Then do tell, how are you defining the creator of the universe in a way that can be measured with science? And what science are you using to measure that? Science is a methodology. Observe, test, repeat. You can observe and test the burning bush if it's in front of you, but you could never repeat it.
A supposed global flood that defies reality, as there wouldn't be enough water on the planet to cover all the land? That is something that exists in reality.
Glad you admit the flood exists in reality. But we can only observe the after effects of the flood, which we do. We certainly cannot repeat it.
Pillars of salt, pillars of fire, water turning into blood, magically raising cities, resurrecting the dead. These are just some of the ways that your God supposedly interacts with the natural world that should and would leave physical evidence. And yet it hasn't.
Well, we certainly have physical evidence of the flood, but floods are natural, salt and fire are both natural, so it isn't really science proving the supernatural, or God specifically, it's philosophy based on the evidence science can gather.
So as to the extension of the divine hiddenness argument goes, God would have had to have disappeared all of that evidence that we would expect to find just to keep his handiwork hidden from us.
Not all of it. I wouldn't expect pillars of salt to still be around. At least not any you could reasonably conclude were the result of some miracle. The flood, though, does still have signs of it's happening all over the world, such as clams found on Everest.
A God who supposedly wants us to know that he exists so that he can have a relationship with us. And he certainly didn't seem to have any problem showing up and proving his existence to all of those people who would have witnessed those miraculous events mentioned before. But now that we've gained the ability to scientifically test these miraculous events, they disappear from the world, leaving no trace at all.
Again, clams on Everest.
There's no evidence of anything supernatural. Well, that's just not accurate. There are medically documented cases of people with demonic possession speaking in languages they don't know, for example, and people with near-death experiences getting information they never had access to.
Okay, I don't think either of those things count as evidence for the supernatural. Once again, isn't the supernatural supposed to be outside of what we can measure? So now he's saying, okay, we can have supernatural things that can be measured, but his previous argument was that God is supernatural and thus we can't measure him scientifically? I think you just shot yourself in the foot. You're willing to say you can have evidence for things in the supernatural, but that we don't have any scientific evidence for God. Wow. It's almost like God's the only supernatural thing that we can't actually find out about.
Nice try, but if you were paying attention, the last argument wasn't that science couldn't prove the supernatural, it was that science couldn't prove God. Proving the supernatural does not prove God. Sure, it may sound absurd to claim there to be a supernatural realm without God, but I don't think there is anything logically contradictory about it.
And don't get me started on NDEs and demonic possession. Please send me the studies you're talking about medically documented demon possession. I find that incredibly suspect. And as for NDEs, they're near-death experiences. They're a phenomenon that happens in our brain while close to death.
See, now you're just begging the question. The point with NDEs is that they heard or saw stuff they could not have heard or seen even if they were wide awake. Your brain does funny things near death does not answer that.
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
Oof, this is just a flat-out lie. We've entered dishonest territory, folks. The Bible absolutely has contradictions. Just take a look at the first 2 chapters of Genesis, which present 2 different creation accounts with timelines that are irreconcilable. For example, Genesis 1 claims that man was created in the 6th day of creation. Genesis 2 claims he was created before plants, so much earlier than that. They cannot be both true at the same time. So what do we call this? A contradiction.
Wow, that's bad. And you want to accuse Zoomer of lying? Chapter 2 does not describe the creation of plants. It describes the planting of a garden. When you plant a garden, you did not cause all plants to exist by planting said garden.
There's also contradictions in the Gospels. For example, the birth narratives of Jesus. In the birth narrative of Matthew, the Holy Family, after Jesus is born in Bethlehem, flees to Egypt. But in the Gospel of Luke, the Holy Family, after Jesus is born in Bethlehem, returns to Nazareth. They cannot be both true at the same time. So what is that called? A contradiction.
It's weird that you keep calling them the Holy Family. Is that a Jehovah's Witness thing? But anyway, Testify actually covered that point not too long ago. They are not contradictions. And there are not any contradictions. None of the atheists in this video were able to show anything better than Panda Tower here.
The Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
This has been debunked so many times. There's so much good scholarship on this. This isn't Brandon's opinion. This is good New Testament scholarship.
Then are you gonna give us the scholarship? And don't just give the names of scholars who think this is debunked. Give the reasons why they think that.
This is just a complete denial of the facts. This guy is just saying arguments and then saying, which is not an argument. And again, I understand I'm not going into like a 30-minute video on how we know the Gospels are anonymous, but we have 40 questions to go through here. But it's just so clear, and not from me, again, from real people who study this with real degrees in New Testament scholarship.
So you say, but if you had really looked into it, then surely you should have been able to give something. Besides, this claim has been debunked. I can't tell you how, but trust me.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can discard their opinions.
No, we can't.
Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you.
But no, just because there's no consensus on which quotes are accurate and which aren't, that most certainly does not mean that the entirety of the Bible, vis-a-vis Jesus' quotes, should be accepted in its entirety as truth.
That is not what he said. I'm pretty sure that every one of the atheists got tripped up on this point. Zoomer was not making an argument for the reliability of any part of the Bible. He was pointing out that if you do not have consensus, then the opinion of scholars has no weight.
That's not how anything works.
Yes, it is. Otherwise, the phrase scholarly consensus wouldn't be something people strive for in their arguments.
Hey, RZ, one person said that you smacked 20 babies. Another person said that that wasn't true, but it was true that you kicked 15 puppies. Another person said that wasn't true, but it was true that you cursed out 12 old ladies. Well, there doesn't seem to be any consensus between the claimants, so I guess we should just accept all accounts as true by default, right? You smacked 20 babies, kicked 15 puppies, and cursed out 12 old ladies. No, that's not how evidence works. Failure to uniformly agree on how to disprove something does not mean that it stands as proven by default.
You just argued against yourself. So Scholar 1 said you kicked babies, Scholar 2 said you kicked puppies, and Scholar 3 said you slapped grandmas, and they all say the others are wrong. And according to you, it is wrong to say they are all right. Well, we agree it is wrong to say they are all right, and here we might differ, but I'd say it's not too much of a stretch to say they are all wrong. I will say Zoomer could have given just a slightly longer answer to this one in order to explain what he meant, since pretty much all the atheists were confused by this one.
Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. He didn't say, I am God, worship me, but he showed that he was God in many places in all four Gospels by doing things that only God can do. It's true that he didn't walk around before his resurrection claiming to be God, because he wanted people to figure it out themselves. That's why he kept saying, who do you say that I am? However, after his resurrection, people figured out that he was God, and Jesus congratulated them.
Did Jesus claim to be God? Does it even matter in this discussion? Honestly, because it depends on which gospel account you focus on, because in some gospel accounts, Jesus is clearly subordinate to the Father, and in other accounts, he's doing things that are usually attributed to God. So you can extract the Trinitarian and a non-Trinitarian belief system from the text, depending on which text you focus on. But again, this argument is not something that an atheist would really bring out. It's more an argument that a non-Trinitarian, like a Mormon, would bring out to a Trinitarian Christian. So I'm not sure why you included it in the list.
This is definitely something you are more likely to see with Muslims, not atheists. So yeah, it would seem like Zoomer could have done without this one. However, atheists are generally non-Trinitarian, maybe even all of them, so it is not a stretch to imagine one saying this. And some atheist probably has.
The later one of the Gospels was written, the more divine it makes Jesus seem, so we can extrapolate that Jesus was originally a human figure who got made more divine over time. Alright, maybe some Gospels emphasize Jesus' divinity more than others, but what about Paul's letters that fully confess the divinity of Jesus and were also written before any of the Gospels? So that breaks your pattern.
Again, I don't think this point is very relevant to our discussion at all, but it should raise some eyebrows at least, because Jesus does become a more legendary figure as the decades go on. Yeah, maybe Paul had a very different view on Jesus than Mark and Matthew and Luke, but the fact that Jesus does become more mythical and more powerful as the timeline goes on should make you be like, oh, what's going on?
So this is one of Panda's worst arguments. He basically hand waves Paul away and stubbornly clings to this pattern that was clearly debunked. Talk about confirmation bias.
The Bible supports slavery. No, it doesn't. Just because there's slavery in the Bible doesn't mean the Bible supports it. There are some Old Testament verses that could be interpreted as condoning slavery, but Jesus himself said that the Old Testament made accommodations to people's sinful state. And also, slave owners in the American South had slave Bibles for their slaves to read, but it omitted a lot of the real Bible, so if the Bible actually did support slavery, this wouldn't have been necessary.
Here's another flat-out lie. The Bible absolutely condoned slavery. God himself gave instructions to the Israelites on how to buy, sell, and punish their slaves. The slaves were property that was passed down from father to son, and you were allowed to beat your slave to death if he survived 1 or 2 days after the beating.
If he is beaten to death, then by definition he did not survive. Now, I take a different tactic than Zoomer. I prefer to clarify that there are different types of slavery, and slavery in and of itself is not inherently wrong. The chattel slavery done in America was wrong, but there is nothing wrong with biblical slavery. Zoomer's argument that God made concession is a weak one, and as pointed out by Panda and perhaps one other, the verse he cites is about divorce, and God making a concession for divorce does not mean he made one for slavery.
All of these commands are under the supposedly perfect law given to Moses by God. So if the law of Moses was inspired of God, as you believe, then it was God who directly condoned these practices. So yes, the Bible absolutely does condone slavery. But what makes all of this even worse is that Jesus, the perfect teacher, never even bothered condemning slavery. Both Jesus and Paul accepted slavery as the norm, and there's not a single verse in the Bible which condemns the practice. Not one.
So what? Some type of slavery will always exist. Even now we have to work at a job to pay our bills. We are in service of our boss and customers. Everyone must choose who or what they serve in life. And if you serve yourself, then you are a slave to your own desires.
The Bible verse you post here is not even on slavery, it's on divorce. And as a last desperate attempt, Redeemed Zoomer brings out the Slavery Bible, which removed a big part of the text to avoid slave rebellion. But the fact that this bastardized Bible version exists does not remove the fact that the original text does condone slavery in a few passages. So nice try, Redeemed Zoomer. You are not tricking anyone here.
Well, you're tricking yourself. The fact that they had to change it proves they could read their Bible better than you, which is weird to say, given how little they cared about it.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds. The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian.
Non sequitur, yada yada, but wrong on all counts. Some of the earliest recorded instances of slavery abolishment happened before Christianity was even a thing. And not in some small, off-the-beaten-path place in the world either. Athens in 6th century BCE, India in 3rd century BCE, and in China during the Zin dynasty, all while slavery was still very much in effect in Jesus' neck of the woods. So Christians weren't the first to get rid of it, just the first to get rid of it in the Western world, which, I mean, duh, pretty much the entire Western world was Christian dominant. But even there, the first Western country to outlaw slavery was France under King Louis X in 1315. But though he was, like all monarchs of that time frame, a member of the church, there's no indication that he was motivated by religion to abolish slavery. In fact, the most major religious-based issue that he dealt with was when he readmitted the Jewish community to France, which his father had exiled.
I don't have any real reason to disagree with anything said there. That seems like a good response. If it is what Zoomer meant, I think Zoomer was specifically talking about America, though, not any or all slavery anywhere. And if I am right, and that is indeed what Zoomer meant, then Plink's only argument here is, so what? Everyone was a Christian at the time, which doesn't work. First, because not everyone would have been Christian, just the majority. Second, and more importantly, you are trying to have your cake and eat it too. The argument being answered is Christianity has supported slavery, which I could just as easily say, so what? Everyone was Christian, or everyone supported slaves, and it would have the same weight as your argument against Christians abolishing it. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
But then, as far as most organizations fighting slavery today being Christian ones, nope. At least, the biggest and most effective anti-slavery organizations aren't. Like, the United Nations, which has made anti-slavery a major part of its charter since 1949. Also, major international organizations like the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking and Anti-Slavery International, which incidentally is the oldest human rights organization in the world, FYI. They're entirely secular.
Funny you mention antislavery.org, because although it may very well be secular now, it was founded by Christians. Oops, kinda shot yourself in the foot just a little there, didn't you? But the argument wasn't the oldest or biggest anti-slavery organizations are Christian. It's that most of them are, so could you not find any statistics on that? I couldn't, but I'm not very good at that sort of thing, and I'm lazy.
God killed tons of people in the Bible. Well, it's actually way more than that. God numbers everyone's days. He's the giver of life, so he can take it, especially if people sin.
So we'll just get around the horrific murder that God either commands or endorses in vast sections of the 800,000 words we have of the canon by saying God creates all life and takes all life. He can do whatever he wants. And to a certain degree, I almost understand the argument. But here's where I would understand it a lot better. If God said we don't have free will, because God killing people is interfering with just letting nature play out.
Okay, what? That makes zero sense. Free will and letting nature play out are not mutually exclusive. What do you even think free will is?
Also, sometimes he has them tortured, sometimes he has them enslaved, sometimes he has them raped. And so for those reasons, I think it's different than just saying, well, God creates everyone and ultimately everyone's going to die, which is God's doing, so he can just change the timeline up a little bit. Okay, then let's get rid of free will and let's start talking then about not the murders and all of the rape, slavery, and torture.
Seriously, Mindshift, do better. Why would we talk about anything if we got rid of free will? Without free will, true dialogue would not be possible.
Atheist countries are more prosperous. Yes, it's true that Northern European countries are very prosperous and very secular, but correlation doesn't equal causation. It's not like atheism causes prosperity, it's that prosperity causes atheism because when people have comfortable lives, they don't feel a need to depend on God. But why are these particular countries so prosperous in the first place? They may be secular now, but they're rooted in generations and generations of Protestant Christianity. If you want an example of a country that's atheist and not rooted in Christianity, look at communist China.
I won't disagree that greater prosperity increases the rates of atheism. I think that's pretty well established. However, the reality of the prosperous countries of Northern Europe is a bit more complex than that. When the countries started to become more prosperous, they did so largely because of the adoption of secular law and government. When religious oligarchy is in charge of a country, especially Christian ones, things tend to go from bad to worse. It turns out, when governments aren't making laws based on religion, but instead on secular ideals that are inclusive to all worldviews and not specifically building their rule on a particular theistic one, things do tend to get better. Just as an example, since you mentioned Northern European nations and you showed their flag, let's look at Sweden. Now, Sweden didn't become an actual secular state until the year 2000. When the Church of Sweden was legally separated from the state. And what happened in terms of their prosperity, such as with their per capita GDP at about the same time? Oh, it started a sharp upturn. where it had previously been on a 50-year decline. You'll find much the same when you look into other similar countries. Once secularism was adopted as the main governmental motivation, prosperity increased, which then followed an increase in atheism among the general public. So even though what you say is true about prosperity leading to higher rates of atheism, it's generally preceded by moving away from theocracy as a governing force. But then you try to cite China as an atheist country not rooted in Christianity that is supposedly not prosperous? Dude, I think you may have lost the plot in terms of what we're talking about here. Now sure, China may be an example of a country with poor civil rights and overarching government control, but I thought we were talking about prosperity. China is maybe the most economically prosperous country in the world right now. Its economic growth is unparalleled. Sure, lots of problems with that country, major disparity between the rich and the poor, human rights abuses and the like, but those are cultural and governmental issues. You'd be hard-pressed to chalk those up to an overabundance of atheism, especially since there is plenty of religion still in China. Frankly, there are higher rates of atheism in most European countries than in China.
I don't have much to say on this one. I think Zoomer's gonna have to defend his own claims on this one. I assume when Zoomer said prosperity, he wasn't talking about money, but I don't know. Maybe that graph that Plink showed was about the government's prosperity and not the people's. Again, I don't know. I'm just gonna have to chalk this up as a win for the atheists and move on.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of god exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
Man, this whole video isn't the gotcha you think it is. How condescending is this video? This tone is really starting to irk me a little bit.
I feel like Mindshift gets easily irked. Like, the more I watch him, the more I think he's just holding back his hatred and anger, and it just bubbles up from time to time.
But you are correct here that in and of itself, saying you're an atheist to 3,999 gods is not looking at the greater picture of God or no God. But that's not how it's typically brought up. I think what's happening here is a straw manning of when these arguments get applied. Where I have talked about this is to try to help the believer maybe empathize with my position. When they're telling me I'm definitely going to hell and I should reconsider because what if I'm wrong? I say, hey, have you considered you might be wrong about the Muslim hell? And when that doesn't click for them, it's just an easy thing to point to and be like, you know, there's a lot you don't believe in. That's how I feel about Christianity. That's at least how I've used the argument and how I've seen other atheists use the argument. Never to say there's definitely no God, just that when we're so convinced for usually either indoctrination or again, where we're born, etc., that the God we grew up with happens to be the one perfect God out of 4,000, we're just trying to give some perspective. This has been going on a lot longer before you were here. A lot of people have had religion. A lot of them have claimed gods that obviously, since all of these gods make mutually exclusive claims, or most of them do, they can't all be real. So have you considered you are also potentially incorrect? That's it.
I still think, what do you mean did the best job refuting this argument? Because the problem isn't that it conflates which religion is true with whether God exists or not. The problem is that it's really dumb semantics.
Yeah, that's not a triangle, it's just a square with one less side.
That's not how definitions work. Is this my lawyer? Oh, okay, good. So I got court tomorrow. I don't know what to say. What do I tell him?
So here's what you tell him. The judge already believes the other billions of people in this world didn't do it, so why not take it one step further and acquit you as well? It's just one more person.
That's not how it works.
You ever kill anyone in real life?
No, I'm not a murderer. Have you?
Just one.
Whatever.
We're all murderers if you think about it.
How? I just said I never killed anybody.
You just killed one less person than me.
It's not how it works.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
I take issue with just about everything you just said. For one, you're again attempting to define God into existence. Well, God is defined as the uncaused cause. Well, I don't care how you want to define him. I don't accept such a definition.
Then how are you defining God? And why should we think your definition is better?
I'm defining universe-belching unicorns from the 8th dimension as the cause of the universe. There, have I now just proven that unicorns belched our universe into existence? No, it's not how it works. You can't just define something as being what you want it to be, therefore it is.
That is not the same thing. All you did there was to define God as unicorns and then make a claim on how he created the universe. The how of the matter was not even brought up in Zoomer's answer.
Secondly, you say, everyone knows there has to be a first cause. No, they don't. Philosophers have been arguing about the possibility of infinite regress for quite some time, and there's no consensus on the matter, especially where origins of existence are involved.
Well, since Mormons somehow believe in an infinite regress, I will assume there is some philosopher out there who thinks it's possible. But any philosopher who thinks an infinite regress is possible is not one I would take seriously.
It becomes even more complex when you consider that cause and effect requires temporality, or for there to be time. A cause must precede the effect, therefore can only happen when there is temporal existence. But there hasn't always been temporal existence. Time and space both came into being with the advent of the Big Bang. So prior to the Big Bang, insofar as our language fails us, as there wouldn't have been a before the Big Bang, but cause and effect would be simultaneous without time. So there could, in fact, be an infinite amount of cause and effect before time began.
Do you see how Plink just argued against himself?
A cause must precede the effect, therefore can only happen when there is temporal existence. So there could, in fact, be an infinite amount of cause and effect before time began. Therefore can only happen when there is temporal existence. Before time began. When there is temporal existence. Before time began.
This is the kind of illogical, inconsistent thinking that you get into when you try and deny a first cause.
But then, as far as the idea that a supposed first cause makes more sense to be a creator god rather than a natural force, no. It makes way more sense that it was a natural event rather than a creator god. This is basically Occam's razor, which is one should not increase beyond reason the number of entities required to explain anything. All things being equal, the simplest solution is often the best one. To put in an easy example, if there is a forest fire, it's more logical to posit it was caused by a lightning strike than an invisible magical fire-breathing dragon.
Notice how Plink goes to Magic Dragon rather than a person, which would have been a more accurate analogy, but it would have given both possibilities the same explanatory power, so of course he wants to avoid that one at all costs.
By positing a creator god, you are unnecessarily multiplying entities. You're assuming a massively powerful, insanely complex, supernatural, metaphysical being in order to start it all off, rather than the much simpler explanation of a hot, dense state of the primordial energy that preceded the Big Bang being unstable and making a natural transition from what it was then to what it is now.
Plink just can't help but refute himself, can he? Let's look at those options again.
You're assuming a massively powerful, insanely complex, supernatural, metaphysical being in order to start it all off, rather than the much simpler explanation of a hot, dense state of the primordial energy that preceded the Big Bang being unstable and making a natural transition from what it was then to what it is now.
First of all, the concept of God is not complex at all. I think he's conflating his inability to understand God with complexity. Second, supernatural and metaphysical sounds redundant to me. How are those supposed to be different? So what we are left with on the theist side is just an all-powerful supernatural being. Now for his side, we have all the energy in the universe in a hot, dense state. So in other words, all power. And all this energy existed before there was any space or even time for the energy to exist in. Somehow. Remember, Plink isn't calling this energy supernatural, so it would require space and time like any other natural phenomena. And this energy is unstable, because he needs it to be. So the atheist side has spaceless, timeless, omnipotent, unstable energy, which changes over time. even though it pre-existed time and should therefore be immune to the ravages of time. It's pretty obvious the simpler solution is the theists. 1. Occam's razor ain't on your side here.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
Is there really any surprise that most of the scientists of the 16th century were Christian? In a time when most of the population was Christian? You already debunked this claim. We both agree that science can neither prove nor disprove God. So why are you bringing it up again? Give me some good arguments, please.
Yeah, this is pretty redundant, though there is a difference. Between the two arguments, the first answer would have covered this one just fine. And in fact, even better, as it would have been more direct. This unfortunately feels like an excuse to mention that Christianity made modern science what it is. Which is certainly true, but I don't think this is the best way to use it. Another point for the atheists.
God is just used to fill in the gaps of things that science can't explain yet. Well, actually, God is the reason for everything, even things that science can explain. It's not one or the other. It's not like everything's explained by either science or God, and the more science can explain, the less God can explain. Really, science can explain almost everything, but God is still behind it all, because science explains the how, and God explains the why.
Is it me, or is his tone getting worse as we go through the video? This is so silly.
His tone is the same. He's just making a clearer distinction between himself and his straw man atheist. Yes, I said straw man. You can't expect him to steelman the arguments when he's doing 40 of them in 10 minutes.
And yeah, I just said some of this, and I actually agree with him on some of this. If there was a God, it isn't God versus science, right? Like, I 100% admit right here, if there's a creator of the universe, it's the thing that created physics. It's the thing that created mathematics. Like, yes, it is the why behind the how, and science is explaining and revealing to it. And that would be such a beautiful thing to really reveal God through science. But again, the fact of the matter is that the particular God claims we've had on this earth so far have also made claims hand in hand about certain things that are disproved by science.
Such as?
That's just not my fault. That's not the atheist's fault. That's not science's fault. It's a reality of what happens when people 2,500 years ago with limited understanding make huge claims that they never thought were going to be able to be knowable, that now we know.
Such as?
That's it. That's all that's happening here. This is just progression. But I agree, if there is some ridiculous atheist out there making a claim that science 100% disproves God and that it's always going to be science versus God, no, but it is sometimes science versus the claims of a particular God. And guess who I'm going to trust? Science. Not always, not emphatically, not without good reason, but if there are things that have been 100% explained and are evident through repeated testing and getting the same outcomes, etc., I'm going to believe that over what a group of individuals 2,500 years ago guessed at.
You're really desperate to avoid specifics, aren't you?
And yes, sometimes science is wrong. Do you know how we know science is wrong? Because more science shows that it's wrong. It tries to correct itself. Religion does not do this. Another reason to trust science over, not God, particular God claims that are mutually exclusive to what we have found with science. I think this is very simple.
Okay, there was some sort of conflation or equivocation going on there. He says he's pitting science against particular claims about God that he conveniently never gives any details on, but then also says science corrects itself and religion doesn't. But you didn't say you were pitting science against religion, you said you were pitting science against certain claims. And when he says religion doesn't correct itself, that conflates all religions into one. Christianity has corrected all other religions. Truth cannot be corrected. It does not matter how you arrived at the truth. The truth itself cannot be corrected. Another distinction I can make is that science is a process to discover the how, and religion is what you do after you discovered the why. And well, the initial why anyway, since why questions can always be followed up by another why.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you. Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it. Well, animals don't sin, so why do they suffer? Well, the Bible says all things will be restored, so if God is good, we can assume that they will be compensated. How do you know that God isn't evil instead? Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light, Evil is just a lack of good, and for good to be objective, it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
Okay, I don't know if that was like one question or 7 questions. It all seemed to revolve around the problem of evil. And wow, what just terrible apologetics for the problem of evil. The first thing that jumps out to me is the insane black and white fallacy of why doesn't God do something about evil now? And the answer being because he'd have to kill you. Whoa. Back it up. Me gossiping with my wife is not a good thing. It's not beneficial. It can hurt other people. It's not edifying for my wife and I to do so. And sometimes we do it. And according to Christianity, it's a sin and thus evil. But that's not what we're talking about when we say, like, why does God allow evil in the world? We say, why does God allow priests to rape 3-year-olds, right? Couldn't God start with a succession of evil before he gets to me and my wife's gossip and has to eradicate us for how lowly and terrible we are?
And in what way that does not prevent free will? Should God do that?
If we did indeed have a God that for whatever reason had higher knowledge and a better insight into the future, said, I need to allow free will, and then never interrupted it, by the way.
Never interrupted it? Well, isn't that arbitrarily convenient? Why shouldn't he be allowed to interrupt it? I know. You want to say that if he interrupts it at all, then why can't he interrupt it in these particular circumstances? But where are you drawing the line? And how are you determining where that line should be? At least, when God actually interrupts certain people's free will, he has a specific reason for that particular circumstance. It's not some general rule that applies to all circumstances. They are the exception to the rule. The rule is free will, and if God made the exception, but no one can harm a child, then it wouldn't be an exception to the rule. It would be part of the rule itself, and it would not be free will. Only mostly free will.
I would understand that there's going to be a byproduct of harm. I still think an all-powerful God, by the way, could get around this.
How all-powerful does not mean the ability to do the logically impossible. So how would he force people to not harm children while maintaining free will and not making children invincible?
But that byproduct of harm is on a scale. And my personal belief is within that scale, there is a huge chunk of unnecessary, avoidable harm, like tornadoes. We don't need tornadoes to have free will, but God created them or allowed them to exist, and they devastate people's lives. That's an example of God being able to do something about some evil without having to kill me and my wife for gossiping.
Tornadoes do not necessarily need free will to exist, but you chose a bad example with that one, since a lot of people harmed by tornadoes literally freely chose to live in a place called Tornado Alley.
Let's look for some nuance instead of trying to take the atheist argument as horribly as you can take it, to exaggerate it to the utmost, to make it black or white, and then just to think you've excused it. And this thing about evil being the absence of good, tell that to God. God said, I created evil.
For a guy who claims to study the Bible, you would think he would know better than that. The verse he is referencing is not talking about moral evil, it is talking about calamity. Now, I will say that Zoomer's answer to why bad things happen, just being we deserve it, is a little lacking. We deserve it is a better answer to why does God send people to hell, but not so much to why bad things in general happen. A better answer would have just been free will. Sure, it wouldn't have answered everything, but it would have covered the biggest amount of bad things, and trying to answer everything would take a whole video of its own.
How to make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself, or that he can contradict himself.
So making another god isn't outside itself. That was just bullshit on toast, sir. Just saying words to explain it away doesn't debunk the argument. And God can't change, so the God in the Old Testament is the same as the God in the New? Ha!
Yes, they are the same God. Welcome to the conversation. You are way behind. But anyway, I highlighted Skeptic here because he, for once, made a good point. I don't think Zoomer gave a good definition of omnipotence here. Making another God would be outside himself, but also the incarnation was doing something to himself. So that is a really poor definition. I prefer to just point out that omnipotent just means all-powerful, meaning someone who has omnipotence has all power. If it's an actual power, then God has it. If God cannot do it, then it is not a power. Simple as that. It would not matter how powerful I am, I could never make a square circle. And anyone who thinks the ability to make a square circle is a power that someone could conceivably have just defined God into existence. And because once contradictions are allowed, everything is real. So even if you could prove God to not exist, he would still exist anyway, because you allowed contradictions.
Why did God let evil exist at all? so he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
Again, tell that to a child with a horrific illness and see how he takes it.
Why the heck would I just randomly tell that to some kid suffering? Don't you have any tact?
A man came into our house, and your mother came home, and he killed her.
What? She got killed? Somebody killed her?
She's fine.
Dexter, what?
You're kidding, right?
I don't understand. You said spend the day at Disney World.
Sorry for your loss.
But guess what? Just because it's not good to just blurt out the truth like that doesn't mean it's not true.
So God allows us to suffer atrocities so he can glorify himself through us? So we're ultimately just puppets, designed to satisfy God's ego. And how could God possibly glorify himself? Glorifying yourself implies that you are going from one lower level of glory to a bigger level of glory. But when we're talking about God, that's impossible because he's literally at the highest level already. So how could God glorify himself through human suffering? Make it make sense.
This is another answer of Zoomer's that I don't really like. The answer to this one is the same as, why did God let bad things happen? Free will. I don't think the language of glorification is really helpful at all, but it is biblical, so let's see if I can make it make sense. I will answer from Zoomer's perspective, based on the answer he gave, because I'm not about to do a Bible study on glorification. But glorification is not some objective standing, it's a subjective standing in the eyes of the people. Humans tend to downplay God, making him weaker or less than he is in some way. The atheists in this video give several examples of this happening. So when God is glorified, it means someone or many people have thought higher of God than they previously did. So it's not that God is made greater, it's that he is seen greater or in greater light.
Religion is just wishful thinking. Well, if that were true, then the Bible wouldn't be all about how much we all suck.
An award for worst answer by an atheist goes to...
What does how much people suck have to do with wishful thinking? That doesn't even answer the question.
Seriously, every other atheist had the same basic answer, that it can say we suck and have wishful thinking, that the two are not mutually exclusive, which is not a bad line of reasoning, but Skeptic is the only one who didn't understand the assignment and is just completely oblivious to the connection. And for the most part, Skeptic's answers are pretty bad, especially in comparison to everyone else, but this one takes the cake.
Psychology explains why you believe in God. So what? If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him.
This is interesting because he took it in a way that I wasn't expecting. Psychology explains why you believe in God, sure. And if God were real, psychology would still explain that. So yes, this is a really bad argument if anyone is actually making this argument to say that God doesn't exist. But to say that there should be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him, doesn't Jesus say that you'll just be punished on earth for believing in him?
Technically tribulation, not punishment, but sure. However, did you forget the last argument about religion being wishful thinking? Where was this argument about tribulation then? And sure, I highlighted Skeptic's answer for that one, but you can check Mindshift's video yourself. He definitely didn't bring it up. You can't claim religion is wishful thinking and at the same time say there shouldn't be psychological benefits because of tribulation in Sade religion.
There are so many Christians that are absolutely miserable. And I'm based off this video, I'm sure this guy would say, oh, they're not real Christians.
I don't see why you would possibly think that. It's almost like you forgot what you literally just said about tribulation. I cannot really imagine someone saying that a person is not a real Christian just because they are going through some stuff. Okay, maybe I can imagine it a little with some prosperity gospel, but Zoomer is obviously not in that camp. And I say this as a Christian who is also currently miserable. There are most definitely some psychological benefits to my faith.
But what I see are people being people having people experiences, people having people thoughts. Psychology is just a description of how some of those processes happen. It doesn't mean there's no God, it doesn't mean there is a God, but claiming that we would have like better psychology or we would experience certain things as believers that non-believers wouldn't, that I feel like has been demonstrably proven false.
Pretty sure Zoomer didn't make any claim about the degree of the benefit, only that we should expect some.
Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals. Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real.
Again, this is just more straw manning of, I think, what people who use this line of argumentation are trying to say is we continue to understand the natural processes behind all of this. And by the way, it's in a response to Christians' assertions. I can't tell you how many times I've heard Christians assert that only via an encounter with the Holy Spirit or God can we have certain kinds of experiences. Oh, speaking in tongues is proof of God. Oh, the bliss, the overwhelming feeling I had during that worship service is proof of the Spirit of God moving in the place, right? There's millions, probably hundreds of millions of claims throughout individuals and all of history that have been about some kind of feeling proving God. So the atheist saying, oh, well, we actually know that these feelings can be produced chemically in the brain and that we can even get these same things to happen through drugs, through music, through sex, etc., is just saying, hey, it's part of the natural human phenomenon. We don't need a God to have it, which invalidates the claim that I had the feeling, therefore God is true. It doesn't invalidate that God is not real. I feel like this individual has just simply not taken the time to understand the nuances of these arguments.
The nuances of the arguments, he says. It's a 10-minute video covering 40 arguments. Why would you expect nuance? We don't have time for that. Also, I doubt that it's only brought up in those examples. In fact, I have had plenty of atheists bring up random points that had nothing to do with my video. Not this point in particular yet, but it's not a stretch to think it happened at some point.
Let's keep going.
Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Ha! I do love this. This has happened like 3 or 4 times where I say something in reaction to what he's saying and then it becomes the next point.
I love that too. It didn't just happen with Mindshift either. Sometimes it feels like Zoomer just has the atheist wrapped around his finger because, for example, Plink will use God of the Gaps argument, and then Zoomer will cover God of the Gaps. Like the atheists are playing regular chess, while Zoomer's over here playing 4D chess, and Skeptic is off on the side playing Chinese checkers.
That's totally fine. Drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. No, I wouldn't say that's 100% true. They showed that our brains are capable of having wild experiences that would otherwise have been called supernatural if we didn't understand what was chemically going on. That's it. But I do love that he is saying here, people who have had NDEs and drug trips say they're different. Oh, okay. We'll just go off that anecdotal experience. Yeah, people that have had orgasms and drug trips say that those experiences are different. It doesn't mean that we can't understand that there is a naturalistic explanation for what's going on in the brain. Man, this guy's really hung up on NDEs. I think they are just the worst evidence for God. Plus, they don't prove your particular God at all. We're gonna have to do a video on NDEs sooner than later.
I think this was one of the answers, where I was torn between using Mindshift and using Plink. They both did a decent job answering it, but my main focus here is that garbage take at the end. First, near-death experiences are awesome evidence of the supernatural and substance dualism. I can only assume Mindshift thinks they're bad because he thinks they are only anecdotal. Or like Plink, he thinks that they all only mention seeing or hearing stuff they could have conceivably known anyway. But that is not the case. They see or hear things they couldn't have possibly have seen or heard. Not just because they were unconscious, but even if they were conscious, they would not have been able to see or hear some of the things reported.
The story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus or some other ancient character. Okay, dude, that's a Reddit atheist-level myth. Even atheist scholars know that that's silly.
It is undeniable that there are significant similarities between the Jesus accounts and other religious mythology. Virgin births, performing miracles like healing of the sick, transmogrification, particularly of liquids into wine, resurrecting from the dead. These are all things that are shared by many various mythologies. Jesus has been compared to a broad variety of figures from various mythological traditions within the Mediterranean basin, including Dionysus, Mithras, Sol Invictus, Osiris, Asclepius, Attis, and Adonis.
Plink does this thing where he puts an article or quote on screen and just reads it verbatim as if it was part of his script, as if he wrote it himself. Now, there isn't anything necessarily wrong with that, because we can see it on screen, but what about people who are just listening to Plink? They don't know he's quoting something else. It feels a bit plagiaristic. But anyway, just saying Jesus has been compared to fill in the blank doesn't mean anything. You can compare anyone to anyone else. The question is it a good comparison? And you didn't provide any citation to any of those claims you just made. You didn't even mention where you were pulling that article from.
Now, I'm not trying to say that the Jesus story is entirely or even marginally plagiarized from earlier myths. In point of fact, I largely don't care about the story of Jesus, as I don't believe that any of the fantastical or miraculous parts even happened. But let's not pretend that comparative mythology that juxtaposes different religious mythology and their central figures don't exist or are all just silly Reddit lies.
Let's not pretend that atheists have ever brought up any good comparisons that have any substantial meaning.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
Faith can mean trust, sure, but when atheists use this argument, they are describing faith as your holy book describes it in Hebrews 11, with faith being the belief in things which we cannot see.
You should really read that whole chapter, not just the first verse or two. Hebrews does not define faith in a single sentence as if it were a dictionary. It spends the entire chapter giving examples of what it means to have faith, and those examples do not fit the definition you just gave.
So in this context, faith is not just trust, it's believing in things despite the lack of evidence, or oftentimes, despite evidence to the contrary.
There is already a phrase for that. It's called blind faith. The term blind faith exists for a reason. If faith was already blind, as you were describing, then the phrase blind faith would be redundant, which it is not.
When trying to prove something as factual, faith is the most dishonest position you could take, because you are claiming something is true without the evidence to back it up. So oftentimes, faith does become the opposite of logic and reason. Now, this doesn't mean that believers are dumb. No, that's not what I mean. It just means that faith is not a reliable way to establish facts.
Well, nobody is claiming that it is. Faith is trusting what you have already established. No one says faith is used to establish facts.
If you tell someone that the earth is round and they come at you with, "Oh, well, I have faith that the earth is flat," then that faith does become the opposite of reason. It's believing in something despite evidence to the contrary, and it's complete madness.
Again, that is called blind faith, not faith.
Evolution proves God didn't create the world. Well, not necessarily. God often works through natural processes in the Bible, and for all of church history, there have been prominent Christian theologians who have had a more metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, even well over 1,000 years before Darwin existed.
I agree, evolution does not disprove the existence of God, but what it does do is disprove the creation myths of Genesis. And that's a huge problem, in my opinion, because of the Genesis myths of creation are allegories, I know you accept that they could be allegories, and I know that you accept that. I know that you say, oh, yeah, they could be allegories, but if they are allegories, then that means that Paul was wrong, because in the book of Romans, Paul builds his whole theology on Jesus' sacrifice, as depending on a literal Adam. So Paul believed that Adam was a real man who introduced sin into the world, and Jesus paid the price to pay for Adam's sin. So if Adam never existed, so then that kind of puts into question the whole theology central to the Christian doctrine, you know? That's the issue with the Genesis stories. Yeah, a lot of Christians do admit that they're allegories, but that poses huge problem to the dogma. So in my opinion, evolution does not disprove the existence of God, but it does make Christian theology fall apart. I know there's a lot of Christians who are willing to make their faith work despite this, and I respect them, but in my case, I just don't find a way to reconcile evolution with Christianity being true.
Yes, there is no way to reconcile the Bible with the failed hypothesis of evolution. Although it is technically true what Zoomer said, Panda is right on the money here.
Christianity only spread because of military conquest. Well, eventually they did do military conquest, but for the first 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal, and it took over the Roman Empire despite that because of how popular it became.
Non sequitur, yada yada. And so what? Judaism has been outlawed pretty famously in some places throughout history. The religion still exists, and existed through the time when being one could get you killed. Buddhism was persecuted during the Tang Dynasty in 841, but it survived and thrived. Religious persecution is nothing new, and certainly was never restricted to Christianity. Nor have Christians historically been anywhere close to the most persecuted religion, regardless of what Christians themselves would like to think.
Stop! That graph is very deceptive, given what Plink said. That study is only giving the population percentage, so it's saying that 99% of Jews lived in countries where they were harassed, but it says nothing about what constitutes harassment, or the severity, and it only covers 1 year. Also, I find that 97% of Muslims live in countries that harass them more than a bit suspicious. Wouldn't it be fair to say that the vast majority of Muslims live in Muslim-dominant countries, so they get harassed in their own country? Are we counting the conflict between Sunni and Shia in that statistic? There is a lot of missing context here.
But your admission that Christianity did spread far and wide through military force and thereby ingrained itself within the cultures that it forced itself on and led to its ascendancy in the Western world is fairly well documented. Had it not, you might not have been born into it and may not be a Christian today. Just something interesting to think about.
I'm not sure why I chose Plink to represent this argument. It certainly wasn't because of that deceptive study, because I noticed that while writing the script after I had already chosen the clips. Maybe it was because they all felt similar and I just needed more Plink to have equal time. I don't remember. Anyway, I seem to remember someone else making a better point, that religion causes wars. And Zoomer just conceded the argument, but in his defense, his voiceover of the argument and what he had written did not match. His voiceover said Christianity was only spread by military conquest. And if that's the argument he meant to go with, then he did indeed answer the argument.
Constantine invented what we now know of as Christianity. Again, Reddit atheist level myth. Atheists can do better than that. Listen to an actual scholar.
Yeah, Constantine did not create what we know now to be modern Christianity. Christianity, like all religions, has been influenced by all the cultures that it touches and has changed and progressed and moved over time. Period. The Christianity we have today is not what Paul had with the new churches in the New Testament. It's also different than it was even 60 years after Paul, or 300 years after Paul, or 1,000 years after Jesus, etc. It has changed, like all religions do, which is interesting because I don't know about you, but if something is perfect truth, I don't see it changing this much.
What do you mean by this much? I think we have very different ideas about what has changed. Culture has certainly changed, and there have been debates on certain topics, but the core of Christianity has not changed. In fact, we have another instance here of Zoomer predicting how the atheist would respond.
If Christianity is true, why are there so many denominations of it? Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
The same could be said for Christianity and Judaism, or Islam for that matter. All are Abrahamic religions that essentially believe in the same God.
No, they don't. Islam does not believe in the same God as Judaism and Christianity. Also, different religions are not different denominations. The argument was about denominations.
But that doesn't stop all of them from holding all the others to be false faiths based on false teachings, even though the central tenets of all of them are largely the same.
Again, no, they aren't. Islam is very different.
Love thy neighbor, do no harm, do not seek vengeance, but turn the other cheek, etc.
All of those were Judeo-Christian, not Muslim.
Not to mention other, non-Abrahamic religions. As a matter of fact, the 5 precepts of Buddhism are basically don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie, and don't do drugs. Now that last one might not be a fundamental part of Christianity, but the other 4 seem to mirror some of the 10 Commandments.
As we would expect, since God's moral law is written on our hearts. But let's try to keep focus. The topic was different denominations, not different religions.
Most major religions agree on more than they disagree, but that doesn't stop them all from seeing the others as false religions. So where is the line? Is it specifically in accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Would you say that that is the line that cannot be crossed, that keeps all the various Christians' denominations still a part of the same overarching faith, despite their many disagreements? Well, if so, sorry, Charlie, not according to the Pope. Back in 2013, Pope Francis said that you don't have to believe in God to go to heaven. Wasn't the only time he said that either. In 2018, when asked by a child whose atheist father had recently died, the Pope told him that his father was a good man and he would be in heaven. So, if your Christianity insists on accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and anyone who doesn't require this isn't a Christian, are you throwing all of the Catholics off the Christian bus now?
No, just the Pope. That is assuming, of course, there isn't some missing context or something.
There's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. Well, that's not true. There's the ancient Jewish historian Josephus who wrote about Jesus, and he's one of the reasons why even secular scholars know Jesus historically existed.
I like that he just lists one. And by the way, I also understand that we canonized a lot of the books that talked about Jesus, so then to say, like, well, where's the extra biblical? Like, I get why that's not a super strong argument, but from a secular perspective, there's not a whole lot, and what Josephus writes about Jesus isn't as good as you think. And I'm not a mythicist. I'm very fine with the fact that someone named Jesus or something similar lived around this time period and said or believed some of these things that Jesus said or believed. Fine. It doesn't prove the truth of anything. So, like, enjoy burning that straw man. I don't know what you are trying to say there.
Now you claim this is a straw man, but you already admitted to knowing that mythicists exist. Sounds more like you are the one straw manning how or when the argument is used now. You say it doesn't prove anything to admit Jesus existed. But did you forget when you said this?
A Christian says X, and it is an unfair claim, an assertion of something that is just ridiculous. The atheist says, well, what about this, to show that that is wrong? And then the Christian says, oh, you're trying to disprove God with this, and that's so weak. No, we're just talking about your earlier point that was unfair.
Yeah, kind of a hypocritical response from you on that one.
You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you? Yes.
That's the debunking of that question? Just yes? Well, good for you, but I think that sounds dumb AF. Well, that seemed like 40 things this one dude thinks atheists think, but actually is more concerned that people hate his religion because it's a little bit silly. No debunking here, my friend. You just pick some random sound bites you think explain what atheists are thinking, but actually probably aren't. The only thing I really think about with my atheism is, am I convinced of any gods? No, I'm not.
Poor skeptic, still not able to follow. The video was called 40 Atheist Arguments Answered, not debunked but answered. And again, atheists tend to make arguments against Christianity.